So hi everyone, I'm Danielle Kaminski from Michigan State University, and I'll be presenting my TAR project, which was on unit quiz submissions and how the time variances across students related to their performance in a flipped classroom. Next slide, please. And so what do I mean specifically about quiz submission time variability? I mean before or after class. And where does this question fit? It fits in the broader context of trying to identify when out-of-class unit quizzes should be due and assigned for students in a flipped classroom setting. Next slide, please. So specifically, in the fall of 2015, I was a TA for a flipped classroom for juniors and above who were majors in agribusiness, and the course was specifically on human resource management. The way that the instructor had established the class was that there were 3 assignments for every module. Class began with a unit quiz, which was multiple choice. Then there was a mini lecture to clarify any points that students wanted. In this mini lecture, the quiz was also reviewed so that the students were provided the answers, and it could work as a formative assessment for them to help kind of target their understanding as the class progressed. Then there was an in-class group assignment, and finally class ended with an individual reflection, which was an open-ended written question that was provided to students, and they had about 10 to 15 minutes to be able to answer that question. But the students felt that the design of this setup was unfair because they were being quizzed before they were being provided the opportunity to ask questions. Now certainly they would be allowed to email questions, but this behavior was rarely engaged in, and the overall perception was that this assessed reading comprehension and retention as much as it was an accountability measure to see if they had done the homework. So being mindful of this, when I was assigned as the instructor of the class this fall, I decided that I had really liked the course design when I had TA'd for it. I thought it was very effective for students, that the group work was especially important for a human resource management class, and I wanted to maintain that same structure, but be mindful of the student concerns that had been raised previously. So I decided to move quizzes online. That was also helpful to me in terms of the grading responsibilities, but then I needed to decide when were they going to be due. Since I didn't know which was most beneficial to students, I decided that I would participate in a teaching as research project and allow students to submit either before or after class at their own discretion. When a student decided to submit before or after class, this was being made in every module. So it wasn't that they committed to something at the start of class, or at the start of the semester. They would be able to make this decision with each course module. Because this is planned in advance, I've received Irb Approval, which also requires that students consent to being included in the study. So the data that I'm using with their grades and their performance, as well as their mid-semester surveys, which every student was responsible for submitting. But of the 31 students in the class, 26 then consented to participation. There are 21 units in the course for a possible number of observations of 546. And then there were actually 476 observations, meaning that we see 70 times where students fail to submit a quiz. So for the level of observations, I'm looking at a student quiz or student module level. And I decided to go one step deeper when looking at the data and divide it into those students who started and submitted before class, started before but submitted after class, and started and submitted after class. As you can see from the table provided, about 23% of students would start and submit before class, but then we had around 77% of students who were submitting after class in some fashion. I wanted to see how grades would be impacted by these decisions that students were making, and I had 3 objectives. The first was to see the quiz grades themselves. The second was to see the reflection and in-class assignments that I also maintained, thinking that the quiz grades may be lower for students who submitted before class, but their in-class grades may then be higher, and the opposite of that for students who submitted after class. So looking to see if this trade-off is actually occurring. And then finally, how students do in the course overall, thinking about in future classes, if I choose not to provide students this discretion, then which would be the better timing, and thinking about overall course performance and student learning. Next slide, please. So for the results of this first objective, just looking at the quiz level, on the graph on the left, we can see the mean quiz scores, and there's the suggestion that the group that starts and submits after class, the one on the right, are lower performers. And indeed, when we run a Crystal Wallis test, which is similar to ANOVA, but it's non-parametric, because as you can see from the graph on the right, the assumption of normality and homogeneity of variances for the ANOVA test is rejected. We do see that the performance or the distributions of those three groups are statistically different. And then based on the means and the distributions, that the students who at least started before class perform better. Next slide, please. So then looking at the relationship between the quiz submission and the in-class assignments that students complete. For the reflection, which is an individual activity, we see that there's little difference between, again, the starting before class and also submitting, or starting before class and then submitting after. But then we do, again, see a difference with those who start and submit after class. In contrast, for the in-class group assignment, there is no statistically significant difference at the 10% level between those distributions and their setup. Next slide, please. Then for the overall course grade, there is a significant correlation when you look at just the simple regressions and simple correlations. However, this effect is very small. So for the two exams, it's about 2% of a difference when you were to move from kind of a 1% or level change in the proportion of times that you submit after class. So here 0 would represent a student who submitted every time before class, and 1 would be every time after class. So here at this level, I'm looking at only 26 observations, which are each of those students who agreed to participate. And then at the final course level, there's only about a 0.6% difference for each 0.1 step that we're taking along the x-axis here.
Great. So Danielle, we have about a minute and a half only just for questions.
Okay.
Do you want to just wrap up, maybe give us your main conclusion?
So I think that in future classes, I'll ask students to submit before class, just as the course had been designed in 2015. Maybe now use the results from this study to help convince students of the benefits of doing this. Emphasize that this is already a low-stakes assessment, and so that they really should be thinking of this in terms of formative assessment. But then there's more research needed in kind of revamping or putting more credence to the results that I see.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. That was great. So there's your acknowledgments, and let me just move to our question slide, and I'd encourage our participants and those folks in the room to add questions or raise your hand. And again, you can add questions via text box with one of your tools. I'll just get us started, Danielle. What was the most challenging part of your project?
So thinking of it kind of different from the traditional discipline that I'm in and what it would mean to have a control group. And so here the selection bias of students in choosing each module, whether they were submitting before or after. So I can't comment on the difficulty of the material and whether that was really impacting their decision, but still thinking about overall performance and what value that provides. And Laura, I think that's a good point, that I can still provide that option, that providing questions ahead of time may help students in targeting what are the most essential questions as they prepare for class, and then have them be able to submit afterwards. So that is also a possibility.